My guest today is Orian Roturier, Head of Growth and Demand Generation at GitGuardian. As an engineer turned marketer, he's passionate about building the right data pipelines and processes that will make products grow. He used to work in consulting to advise all kinds of companies on their acquisition strategy. Then he chose to focus his efforts on GitGuardian, a cybersecurity SaaS company, as he reckoned that cybersecurity is both a complex and important topic, given that now most of our lives are online. Growing GitGuardian from Series A to Series B, he focused on inbound tactics, targeting cybersecurity teams, and a product-led growth funnel for developers. In this episode, we start by understanding the cybersecurity topics that a product manager should know about and should prioritize to reduce the risk of reputational damage and potential fines for their product and company. Orian explains his role compared to traditional product marketing and product management functions, and how his company is implementing product-led growth by focusing on some specific personas, as well as how the Pirate frameworks helps him to measure success. This is a great listen for practical tips on security, GitHub optimization, starting a product-led strategy, and working with growth teams to deliver it. Hi, I'm your host, Magali Pellissier, and I'm a product manager. Welcome to Product Perspectives, the podcast for product people that gives a voice to their stakeholders. Each week, I show you the other side of the product. I interview the people who contribute to making products a success. They are engineers, writers, marketers, support analysts, UX designers, or even salespeople. Not only will I give them the credit they deserve, but will uncover what makes a good product and a good product manager from their perspective. Stakeholders management is a key skill for product managers. So just as you are obsessed with listening to your customers, let's hear from your stakeholders. Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm very excited to have you because you are Head of Growth at GitGuardian. So could you tell me more about what your company does first?
Sure. Thanks, Magali, for having me today. So GitGuardian is a code security SaaS company. We detect secrets in source code. So to tell you a bit more about what's a secret, it's basically everything that your company would like to keep secret in the context of source code. So usually it's an API key or other forms of credential, database access keys, this sort of stuff. And so these secrets are very commonly found on GitHub, especially on public GitHub. Even today, if you type in removed credentials on the GitHub search bar, you'll find tons of credentials still valid in the previous version of the public source code. And so this has become a problem lately, and GitGuardian aims at addressing that.
Great, thank you. I like how you simplify the technical details. And you were an engineer before, so why did you make this transition to marketing?
Yeah, so, it happens. No, just kidding. So at the start of my career, I started working in data and analytics consulting firm where I was one of the first employees. And so I worked with companies of different typologies, B2B, B2C, different sizes. And after a few years of consulting came the moment where I wanted to keep helping grow a new company. And cybersecurity was a very interesting field for me because finding meaning in the workplace is very important nowadays, right? And now how it is for you, but for me, it was definitely one of the criteria I wanted to look at for my new company. And so when I learned about GitGuardian, there were really two things I loved. First, the cybersecurity aspect. Especially with the current geopolitical climate we're in, cybersecurity is definitely an important stake in the 21st century, I feel like. But also on the fact that GitGuardian helps protect developers' source code for free if you're an individual developer. This I found awesome. And so for me to find value in my workplace, it was a no-brainer to join GitGuardian.
Great. And you've explained the challenges that your company is helping to solve, but can you help me understand why an engineer would put some credentials in public GitHub repositories? Why are some of the industry best practices not applied?
Well, the thing about secret and source code is that you and me, as a growth person, as a product manager, even us, we do have manipulate credentials and API keys from time to time, right? When we want to try something out. And so what usually happens is that it's a mistake. So even if you have good secrets management practices enforced in your company, in your environment, a mistake can still happen. We saw that it happens a lot to individual developers working on open source projects on the weekend because, well, you don't have the same setting than at work. And so we saw the mistakes tend to happen a bit more often around weekends, for example. And because that's where we find the most API key leaks. But it's a mistake. And as a mistake, it can happen at one point or another. It's probabilistic. And even if the probability is fairly low, if you have hundreds or thousands of developers in your company, even if you have good secrets management practices, a mistake will happen at one point or another. There will be thousands of commits per month at your company. And so one of them might end up containing a secret, even though it's a bad practice.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and we all make mistakes. I make so many per day, but they don't have the same impact, I guess. Well, they do on the strategy, but not on security, I guess. So now you are head of growth. So what is it exactly?
So here I'm going to quote Dave Kellogg. He's an amazing CEO and CMO, then turned consultant for VC funds. And as he says, growth and marketing's job is really to make sales job easier. And we're really taking this philosophy at GitGuardian because as a SaaS company, the sales are relying a lot on the pipeline that we are able to create for them. Especially at GitGuardian, a lot of our turnover comes from inbound lead generation. So marketing is really key in providing enough pipeline so the sales guys have enough to eat on their plate, right? And so that's really the core mission of the head of growth as me at GitGuardian, really helping sales make their life a little easier.
Great. So do you report to the CMO? How is the team and the marketing organization structured?
So indeed, at GitGuardian, growth and marketing, we really have three different fields. We have growth and demand generation on the one hand, which is my team. We have product marketing management, and that's a team very close to product, but also to sales to provide some sales enablement material, for example. And then we have content at GitGuardian. It's an awesome team made of former developers turned to content to really explain what are secrets, why it's important, what we do, and provide some very in-depth article that will interest security people, but also developers that are conscious about security.
Very interesting. So you're a marketer, but initially you were a developer. And you also say that some of the developers are turned into content now. So is it because what you're dealing with is very technical? Do you think that a product manager in the cybersecurity field needs to have technical knowledge?
It's a good question. At first I would say, yeah, definitely, at least a little bit, right? I'm a marketer and I do have some knowledge now about cybersecurity. Same for our content people. Same for our sales reps. They tend to be pretty technical. So there is definitely a common background in technical fields, even if it's not especially cybersecurity. But our product marketers tend to be pretty technical as well. But I'd also like to say that just like CISOs, so really the chief information security officers in charge of cybersecurity at bigger companies, there are different types of CISOs, right? Some are more business oriented, some are more tech oriented. And I think at GitGuardian and at most cybersecurity companies, it would be the same. This is a spectrum, and it's better if you're at least a tiny bit interested in cybersecurity for sure, but you can still get some training once you join GitGuardian if you're business oriented enough or bring something else to the table.
Okay. And do you have any resources or books or online courses or blogs that you recommend following to get that technical knowledge if there are product managers listening to us who want to move to the cybersecurity field?
Definitely. I mean, I think there are a lot of paid cybersecurity trainings that you don't necessarily need to do, considering there is a lot of great content on YouTube or free Udemy courses. I followed one, for example, to better understand what does a blue team do, what does a red team do. And I think that's a decent first layer. Reading OWASP as well, it's a great resource on the most common sources of vulnerabilities. And so understanding the OWASP top 10 can do it by themselves without necessarily following a course, and it can get a first foot in the world of cybersecurity.
Great. Thank you very much for those resources. So I've seen on your website you have the most recent Forrester report on the state of application security, and they mentioned that applications remain the top attack vector. So development teams have more responsibilities to handle the day-to-day security issues. As product manager, I work day-to-day with the development team. So how can I help them? How can I make sure that my team is focused on security? Because it's not always something we think about when we think about our roadmap, right? We think new features, but security tends to be in the technical depth area, so we don't prioritize it enough.
Well, that's really a new way to thinking of security is what we call shift left, right? It's better if you shift security left of the software development lifecycle, because if you go on a waterfall model and do security at the very end, well, there are a lot of issues with that. You will miss a lot, and it will be much more expensive than actually doing it along the development lifecycle. So for that reason, and to not build any technical debt related to security, we actually encourage product managers to become GitGuardian users as well. And I guess it would be also a good advice for competing or complementary products such as Sneak, for example. They do amazing things on scanning for vulnerabilities. And I think it can be a good hobby for a product manager that thinks security is an important topic for the company to play around with these tools a little bit. And you can discover some pretty interesting stuff about your company. I'm sure with GitGuardian Scan, for most companies, we will find a few API keys that are not hashed and that could be exploited by a malicious user. And so it's definitely a good idea to take the tool for a stroll.
Great. So assuming that product managers do what you've just recommended, they go in the tool, they find, and they can actually witness the security vulnerabilities. So this is what I'm assuming some of your customers have done as well. Have you seen real examples of companies implementing some changes, new policies, or changing their roadmap to make sure that they are better on the quality side?
For sure. I mean, at GitGuardian, we have, in terms of marketing, we have different sales funnels, right? One sales funnel directly addresses the cybersecurity personas, and they try the product themselves. Maybe we do a POC with them. And this is really, we directly talk with the usual decision maker who has purchasing power on cybersecurity tools. But sometimes we also go on a product-led growth funnel where anyone at the company can try the product because it's free for individual users. And so we got developers or product managers, as I was mentioning, that can try the product. And the idea here is really to either have several stakeholders inside the company, like, hey, we got 1 PM, 2 developers that are using GitGuardian on their personal accounts. I think it could be a good idea to scan your repositories. It will be free also for the duration of the trial. So we should definitely scan what you get for us and see if there are any vulnerabilities that we could address. And from there, it's usually a straightforward conversation, especially if we find some keys that ring a bell and could be potentially exploited. So it's definitely another way to acquire some users for us.
Right, and you've moved down to my next topic, which was product-led growth. So you've indicated to me that your company is moving from a sales-led model to a product-led one. So what does that mean in practice?
So yeah, first, I mean, product-led growth is sort of a buzzword that has been thrown around a lot, at least in the growth echo chamber that I'm following. And it's been implemented with varying degrees of effectiveness. It's a very attractive framework, especially for investors, because it's very scalable, right? It's less reliant on sales. That can be an expensive resource. And so it helps really scale the company a lot faster. And so for us, originally, indeed, we were directly contacting with sales rep involvement along the whole funnel, but this ends up not being that scalable anymore. You have to hire a lot. And so we decided to move on to a product-led funnel. Both funnels are still working in parallel, right? Because the sales-led funnel will directly talk with application security engineers, CISOs, basically security teams. Whereas on the product-led growth funnel, as I was mentioning, we will address other kinds of personas, product managers, software architects, software engineers that are trying the product, and both really work well together for us.
Okay, so what's very interesting is that you're not targeting the same personas, because I think I see some companies saying, oh, we can't move to this product-led growth approach because we are targeting, senior people in the organization, and they wouldn't be the ones using a free trial or getting started and having their hands on in the product and saying, oh, and having that haha moment, as you say it. So the fact that you're targeting different personas is quite interesting. So where did the need come from? Who was the driver of this decision to take a product-led growth approach?
Well, actually, it's a funny story, because when we started GitGuardian's commercial activity, we wanted to scan what happens on public GitHub at first, which we still do. And then we realized we were catching a lot of secrets volume in there. And when detecting all of this, selling that to a few customers at first, it was still a lot of vulnerabilities that can be bad for the developers themselves, right? It's not only bad for companies, but also for the developers, for the repetition risk. But also, if you leak cloud provider API key like AWS or GCP, it can be exploited. It can be pretty bad for the developer as well. And so at first, we were just generally trying to bring value and just thinking, well, if I were this developer, I would like to be warned that I have a valid API key in the wild on public GitHub. And so at first, we just emailed those people, totally pro bono, just saying, hey, we found a key on something that we were just working on. If I were you, I would rotate. And by the way, you can sign up to GitGuardian. And so at first, it was really on this genuine motion of trying to warn developers about a mistake they just made. And then it turned into a real acquisition funnel for us.
Great. So what are the metrics you're using to measure the success of this initiative?
A framework I really liked working with product-led growth was the Pirate or R framework. So we will look at the numbers on acquisition, activation, even retention, referral, and finally revenue. And it was a really great framework to start working together on this issue. So at first, we were looking with this first email, this first warning we were sending on just the open rate. Are people interested in what we are doing? Yeah, okay, they seem to open it a lot. So let's keep bringing value. And will they click on the email? Yeah, for sure. And so we added KPIs after KPIs to make sure we provide a good onboarding flow. So those were first the email KPIs, but then we have others once they land on the product page. Do they sign up? If they sign up, will they get to the aha moment? Will they get the value of the product? And then we came up with an activation rate. And we really started building this full R funnel together with product managers. And this ended up being quite a full funnel where now we can say, hey, today, this week, we can do some experiments to try and improve the activation rate, for example. And the other week, we will try to improve the open rate, which will ultimately improve acquisition.
So you've just mentioned product managers. Does that mean that once you've identified something you want to improve or a strategy you want to implement, you work with product managers to implement these? Or do you have yourself a team of developers who implement the changes you want?
So what we chose to do at GitGuardian is that we do have a team of growth managers that is focused on our acquisition funnel, especially on the sales-led side. But we also have a product-led growth squad, which has one growth manager, one product manager, 2 developers for now. That is still growing. And with this squad, we will try to improve this funnel I just described. And so we do have some developers, and whenever we can come up with a new idea, if it's something that doesn't require any technical implementation, well, the growth team can manage it themselves. And if we need some development work, then it will enter the growth PM's roadmap, and the developers will be able to work on it in the next sprint.
Great. So how do you work with this growth product manager then? What is your interaction like? Because sometimes it may look like you could be overlapping on some of the aspects of the strategy.
For sure. Well, what we've been doing is we have a weekly with the whole team, reviewing the pipeline of experiments we want to drive together. We try to feed this pipeline during the quarter with the ideas that we both have. Usually the growth PM will have the more technical ideas. The growth manager will have ideas that are more around emailing or usual acquisition funnels. We just mix all of that together. Sometimes we also have some brainstorming sessions, especially at the beginning of quarters to fill in the pipeline a little bit more and get some new ideas. And then we just split the work between technical work and non-technical work or less technical work that the growth managers can do in no-code or in low-code tools. And then it gives us our roadmap for the quarter usually.
Do you see that sometimes you're stepping on each other's toes, or are there some challenges with the way the organization is set up, or do you think this is the best way to operate?
I think it's a pretty good way to get things started. As product-led growth will take more and more importance at GitGuardian, we will have to see how the team evolves, because it might become a major engineering squad at some point, in which case it will be a bit harder to manage than just having 2 developers at the moment. But for now, this works fine. So we will definitely have to see how it evolves. But I think it was a very interesting, I'd say, selling point for employee to have not only your own team, but also a cross-team squad where you can exchange with peers from other fields of work and not only discuss between developers and product managers on your topic. So I think this cross-team collaboration so far has been a pretty good success.
Great. And that's a good transition to the next section of this podcast, which is somebody you know who is a product manager asking you a question. So this is a question from Enzo, who is product manager at Teal.
Hey Orion, it's Enzo from Teal. I would like to ask you, how should growth and product start working together?
So that's a good question. I think the first thing will be to align on the goals, obviously, because depending on your company, on your business model, on what you are actually selling, product-led growth may or may not be suited for you. And so the very first thing will be to build a RACI matrix to know who's responsible, accountable, etc. for what topic, and see how we can overlap without, as you were saying, stepping on each other's toes. If, just like GitGuardian, you are in a product-led growth company, then congrats, that's awesome. Then you need to decide how you will start working on it together. What I'd advise as a growth person at the beginning is to find the one channel that will work for you. You don't need to deploy tons of marketing tactics that can be very time consuming to get your first users on the product. What I've seen from my experience is that some paid acquisition is usually good for startups at the beginning. Some strategies a bit more original, like the emailing strategies we've had due to the nature of our product detecting leaks on public GitHub. It worked very well for us. So basically we just picked these 2, double down on it at the start, and it can get a good acquisition funnel started to get enough volume for growth and product to start collaborating together. Then I would say next and very important step is to start implementing analytics early. In my background, I come from a very tracking analytics, web analytics background, really enjoyed those sort of topics. And so I think it's very important to get started with this earlier rather than later, because if you want to do some comparison, if you want to measure things, actually, I like to say what gets measured gets managed. And so as a product manager, it's very important to measure early, even if the volumes are a little bit low, to take some statistically significant decisions. It's still important to have just an idea of how things work on your product, maybe implement some Hotjar as well to track what users are really doing. And then after you've done this, I think it's a good time to see if you want to work on a roadmap together and on improving your product-led growth. But I think those are really the basics of the collaboration at first.
Great. And you said your background is in website analytics, and your company also does SEO for GitHub. So can you tell me more about this? Why is it important, and how does that fit into your role?
Well, as I've major acquisition funnels, and so we So SEO is a part of inbound acquisition. As I said, we have content managers creating awesome content, so we need to make it rank somewhere on Google. But SEO it actually means search engine optimization, right? It doesn't have to be Google. And there is another search engine that can be pretty powerful, especially for developer-focused companies or cybersecurity companies, and that is GitHub. GitHub is actually a social media too. And so just like making campaigns on other sort of social medias, there is actually quite a lot you can improve on GitHub. So that's why we recently started working on our GitHub SEO. It's really the tiny things, but just optimizing the about section of your GitHub repositories, the topics that your repository is covering, as well as the README file, making it a bit pretty, adding some badges, and especially above all, adding some SEO-friendly content, but also engaging content on the README section. That will just do a lot of the way for most people. So it really doesn't have to be forced, but there are still some smaller optimization that we can make. For example, one tip I discovered lately is that it's actually useless to have a topic, this topic section of GitHub with a dash in the middle. So for example, for us, we target pre-commits, but if we put a dash in the middle of pre-commits, we cannot put a space in the GitHub topics. And if we put a dash, it will only match if people exactly write down pre-dash commit, which nobody does. Nobody uses dashes on search engines anyway. And so that's why you would have to write pre-commit in one word or pre and another tag being commit. And the sort of smaller stuff that you have to dig in the GitHub search engine optimization a little bit to see, and that it can actually easily quite double your traffic to your GitHub repositories. So it's still a good way to make your product discoverable.
Great. Thank you very much for the explanation. Very useful and practical tips to implement for people who listen. So let's move on to the last part of the interview, which is I am going to make you several suggestions and you pick one of them. So the first one, given your background, but you were engineer before you moved to marketing. So marketing or engineering?
Well, I'd still say marketing, because one of the reasons I moved to marketing is that engineers can be awesome, have awesome ideas, but not always bring it to the people, right? Marketing is basically just take an awesome idea, explain it to the market. So explaining to everyone to whom it could be useful. And so after a few years in this field, I'm really convinced that bringing value to people, finding meaning at work by putting the work of others, awesome, very smart people forward, it's really fulfilling. And so I definitely say marketing now.
Artificial intelligence or blockchain?
It's a funny question. It's the sort of consideration we've been having because we do have an R&D team at GitGuardian. And so we're often coming to see them with, hey, what do you think of machine learning for secret detection, or even why not writing things down in the blockchain? And often enough, machine learning could bring a little something, but it's very important to go down to the basics and make sure you implement the most efficient solution. And sometimes, regular expressions can be better than some machine learning models. They are easier to explain to customers. And so for that reason, I'm not convinced these two domains will be that widespread for some cybersecurity fields, although I definitely lean more towards machine learning in terms of fraud or anomaly detection when there are some real proven use cases already. So maybe not necessarily for GitGuardian, but for cybersecurity as a whole, I'd say machine learning would be the winner there.
Which persona do you prefer? So I think you've got the individual contributor engineer who does a side project and code on GitHub. You've got engineer as part of an enterprise company. You've got also CISO with more senior leadership. So which persona do you prefer?
That's a hard question for a marketer because I really try to be empathetic with all of the personas that we are targeting. So it would be a bit hard to decide between all of those. As head of growth, I really need to work on all of my funnels. So I will pass on this one.
Okay, thank you very much. So one last piece of advice for product managers who have listened to this interview and they realize, oh, it would be great to have a head of growth person with a team dedicated to growth because they're doing this on their own and they could do with some specialist support. So how should they convince the organization that this role is needed? What do you think they can do to emphasize this for their company leadership?
Growth has been pretty mainstream these past few years, right? Especially since the book Hacking Growth came out. Growth and demand generation are usually coming in most companies slightly before around Series A if you're on a fundraising model. What I think one of the most obvious things product managers can explain to leadership is that it's always better to have more volumes on the product. As a product manager, you will have a lot more data on how people are using your product, but also on a more strategic level. If you are hesitating between features, one of the things growth managers are very used to doing is create what we call a painted door test, which can be very, very simple, just putting together a landing page, explaining what your new feature will do. Even if you have not developed it yet, and especially if you have not developed it yet, it can be a very great signal to see if the market is reacting well to what you product management people have put on the roadmap. And growth people are very good early to do that. So I'd say if you want to have a growth person earlier than Series A, that would definitely be a good argument because they would be able to help you also strategically with the decisions on how the market will react to your product.
Right. And I love this idea of testing the demands beforehand and you using that to justify the investment. So if people want to contact you after listening to this episode, what should they do?
So I'm always glad to take a call and discuss with my peers about growth, product, and marketing, because I really think that's one of the best ways to learn, at least in growth. Obviously, for product people, listening to product perspective is another great way to learn. So for me, I would be glad to answer on Twitter, but also on LinkedIn. Even if my LinkedIn is mostly in French, I will be very happy to connect and have a chat.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your time and all those practical advice. Thank you.
Thank you, Magali. See you soon.
Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it has enabled you to understand your stakeholder and inspired you to better work with them to make successful products. If so, please share the link with your friends and colleagues. And if you want to suggest some topics, some guests, if you have questions you'd like me to ask during the interviews, or if you have any feedback, you can write to me at magaliepellissier@hotmail.fr.